So, all right, so the recording has started. Thank you, everybody. So thank you for joining us for Beat the Heat Summer Lawn Care Guide with Texas A&M AgriLife. My name is Helen Dulac. I'm the Public Education Manager for the North Texas Municipal Water District, and we're really excited to be sharing this virtual Lunch and Learn webinar series with you to help you water efficiently and have the best landscape possible this summer. Our speaker is Dr. Becky Boland, Associate Professor and Extension Specialist for Urban Water with Texas A&M AgriLife. She's busy spending a lot of her time talking to audiences about the topics of environmental stewardship, water conservation, and water quality protection for urban landscapes and beyond. Through her work, Dr. Boland strives to build and maintain relationships with a wide range of influential stakeholders and regulatory agencies to ensure that urban water extension program reflects the needs and priorities of its diverse clientele throughout Texas. So thank you so much for being with us today, Becky. Please take over.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, Helen. I'm excited to be here with everybody today to talk a little bit about our lawns. And so I'm already seeing some questions come in. So hopefully we'll answer a lot of these good questions as we go through today. You know, we have a limited amount of time, so I'll just ask you to keep that into perspective a little bit. There's a lot we won't be able to cover today, but hopefully we'll have some good time for questions at the end and at least hit some of the highlights. So let's just jump right in. So I like to teach this when I have limited time. Usually I like to teach it as kind of a checklist. So these are some major things that you can do that are going to be, I would say, more environmentally responsible practices throughout the year when you're thinking about keeping your lawn healthy and happy. If your yard is anything like mine right now, it's looking a little crunchy, a little toasty. Nothing wrong with that. That's something that we expect this time of year in the North Texas area, especially if we're under a drought, which we are right now. In fact, when I drive around town, if I see a lawn that looks too green, I'm a little bit judgmental. I start to think, hey, you're probably watering way too much. Lawns shouldn't look that green in Dallas in August. So, all right, let's just jump right in here. So one of the first practices that I talk about a lot when I talk about lawn care is mowing. This is a practice that most of us are going to do, even if we don't do anything else. So even if you don't water, you don't fertilize, most of us are at least going to mow the grass. And the way that we mow our turf can actually have a really big impact on how resilient it is and how well it deals with certain stresses. So in general, what we recommend right out of the gate is to keep your lawn at a little bit taller mowing height. This is counterintuitive for a lot of people. I see a lot of folks that try to mow it as short as possible. This can actually create a lot of issues with your lawn. First of all, one of the things that we see is a relationship between the leaves above ground and the roots below ground. We call this the root to shoot ratio. This is something that we see with any plant. So the taller you allow that plant to grow, the more above ground biomass that plant has, the more roots we're going to see. And the key to a resilient lawn, the key to resilient plants in general, is going to be having really good, dense, deep root growth. So we want to do everything we can to encourage that. Grasses can root much more deeply than most people think or realize. We will see, for example, with some Bermuda grasses, if I happen to have a nice, deep, sandy soil, which we don't typically have up here, I might see that Bermuda grass root several feet into the ground. In fact, I've personally seen Bermuda grass root as deeply as about 10 to 13 feet. So these grasses have the potential to root much more deeply than we often give them credit for. And we're seeing that there's a lot happening with new grasses that are coming out. And if you happen to have something like Tiff-Tuff Bermuda grass, which is one of our newer Bermuda grasses, that's a grass that can root very deeply and in fact relies upon that to be very resilient in a drought like this. So we're going to see that when we keep that mowing height a little bit taller, we'll see improved water infiltration. This means that we'll get better water capture when we do water, when we do get rainfall. You can think of each of those little roots as being kind of like a channel for water to move into the soil. And we want to create as many of those channels as possible to create kind of a sponge in our landscape. We see that those roots can access deeper resources, so nutrients, water that's deeper there in the soil. We see improved overall resilience. So not only are you going to get better drought tolerance with these deeper roots, you're also going to see that in the wintertime, you'll get better cold tolerance. If you've got dogs or kids, you'll get better traffic tolerance. So deeper roots corresponds to more resilient, stress tolerant lawn overall. You'll also see if you keep that mowing height a little bit taller, we'll often get some benefits from weed crowding. We'll kind of shade the soil and keep our turf grass more competitive with weeds that are trying to come up. And then this is also counterintuitive. We will also see that a taller mowing height actually means a reduced mowing frequency. A lot of times I get people that think the opposite of this. They think I'm going to mow it as short as possible because then that means I'm not having to mow it as frequently. But actually what we'll see, which I think I'll talk about here on the next slide or two, is that the best way to mow is to never remove more than about a third of that height at any one time. So the taller our grass is, the longer it takes for us to get to that height where we want to remove that third. If you see a lull, let's say that you mow it really, really short because you yourself have witnessed that lull or that slowdown in growth, what you're witnessing is plant shock and stress. And during that time, the plant is pulling reserves from its root system. It's losing its resilience and competitiveness. So you're putting that lawn through unnecessary stress that is not going to help you keep it healthy during this really stressful time of the year. So I will tell you that I have not mowed my grass in probably 3 or 4 weeks now. It's just been so dry. It hasn't been growing very actively. And whatever height it's got, I've just let it keep. This is from a publication you can find on our AgriLife Learn website, and I'll get that AgriLife Learn link for you here in just a little bit, but we do have a mowing recommendations for warm season turfgrass publication. It's got this very basic table in it to give you a sense of what those mowing heights might look like for different turfgrass species. If you've got a St. Augustine grass lawn, you should expect to keep that lawn height much taller than for some of our other species. Another thing I'll commonly see is folks trying to mow St. Augustine at about a 2-inch mowing height. Certainly for this time of the year, I would not recommend that. My St. Augustine grass that I've got right now is kept at about 4 inches in height, does a lot better at that height in this heat than it will at a shorter mowing height, again, because it's just going to have deeper roots and better opportunity. So along with that, here's our rule number 2, or our checklist number 2, is that we do want to follow that 1/3 rule. When possible, we want to mow in response to the rate of growth, and we never want to remove more than about a third of that total canopy height at any one time. When we remove more than that, we scalp the turf, and again, we put it into shock, we stress it unnecessarily, and it's going to significantly compromise its resilience, particularly when we're under extreme weather conditions, which we are right now. So if you are still seeing that your lawn needs to be mowed frequently, let's say that you've got a pretty shaded St. Augustine lawns, those are lawns that are still growing pretty actively, even in our drought, just try to avoid removing more than about a third of that height at any one time. That's going to help your grass respond better to that mowing and keep it healthier and more resilient. If you happen to get taller than you expected, maybe you haven't been able to get out and mow in a while, our recommendation is that you just gradually take it down to that desired mowing height instead of lopping it all off at one time. So this is a practice that I often recommend. We get a lot of misinformation or confusion around this practice. If your lawn is relatively healthy, you don't see a lot of pest issues in that lawn, then I highly recommend that you mulch your lawn clippings. This means instead of bagging those clippings and removing them from your lawn, you're allowing them to disperse across that area and naturally decompose back into that system. This is going to significantly improve nitrogen use efficiency in that system. In other words, I'm not going to have to fertilize this lawn as much because I'm allowing those nutrients to be recycled as part of this mowing process. If I bag and I remove those nutrients from the system, I'm removing them completely, which means I'm going to have to be back out there with fertilizer more often than if I just allowed them to decompose naturally. We'll also see that clipping recycling or clipping return can offer some benefits in terms of our soil microbes and our soil health, because you're allowing some material there to be broken down and to become food for those organisms. So a lot of benefits there. The only time that we might not want to mulch our clippings is going to be if I have waited way too long to mow and my clippings are going to be real long and very dense, or if I do have a known pest issue. Let's say that I've got a disease or an insect issue, or I have a significant weed infestation and those weeds are flowering or producing seed. Those are times where I might want to bag and remove those clippings, kind of like biohazard material, just because otherwise we might see that we're spreading that problem out. We also want to make sure that if you do mulch your clippings, you avoid leaving any heavy piles or lines behind. Can actually cause your turf to burn this time of year. So if you're out there, let's say that you're out there mowing kind of early in the day, which many of us like to do when it's really hot out, we might see that there's more moisture, more dew in those clippings, and they might stick together a little bit more. So that's where I would recommend either go over it a couple of times to help disperse it, or just take a little leaf rake out there and try to spread those out a little bit more. Now, Helen mentioned irrigation. This is a huge priority for us. We want to be as efficient with our watering practices as possible. There's never a time that we feel that more than when we're in a drought up here in North Texas. And it's been some years since we've really felt the pressure of a drought here. And what I tell people is that drought is going to have the biggest impact on the unprepared. And so, whether you get to this year or you're thinking about future years, take a look at your irrigation system. Think about how can you create a system that's going to be as efficient and as effective as possible. And this can often start with just thinking about what kind of nozzles or heads we're seeing on that system. So, we see on a lot of irrigation systems up here in North Texas that the default a lot of times is going to be these fixed spray nozzles like you see in this first image. Those of you that have lived here long enough and have seen these run know that there's no way that they're very efficient with our high temperatures and our wind. A lot of times this will look like a fine mist. You can imagine that a lot of that water never makes it to our turf grass, never makes it to our soil. Throughout the year, we see that about 31% of our household water gets used outdoors. This time of year, that goes up to between 50 and 70%. And we might see that as much as 50% of that water never gets taken up by plants. It's being lost to evaporation, wind, and runoff. And so we want to try to minimize that as much as possible. If we're going to run that irrigation system, we want as much of that water to hit our turf, hit our soil, and be taken up and used by plants as possible. So that's where I would suggest maybe you swap these fixed spray nozzles out for these multi-stream rotary nozzles like you see in this second photo here. These are going to be those slow, kind of mesmerizing sprinkler types. They're going to put out water at a lower precipitation rate. This means that it takes a little bit longer to put out the same amount of water. But when you think about it, that's really what we want, because the lower and slower that water is, the more control we have and the more likely that water is to infiltrate into our soil. If we put out too much water too quickly, a lot of times with our heavy clay soils, we're going to see a lot of that water run off. And so multi-stream rotary nozzles, swapping those out can be one very basic, easy way to immediately improve efficiency in your irrigation system. Another good way is going to be not so much on the lawn side, but if you've got ornamental beds where you've got shrubs and other kind of plant materials like that, swapping that from this sort of nozzle type irrigation to drip irrigation. You'll see a significant improvement in efficiency there as well. We see that drip irrigation is up to 90% or more efficient in landscapes compared with some of these options, which may be as little as 50% efficient, depending on how they're operating or how they're running. This rotor head option, this number 4 option here, is going to be something that we see that's very comparable in efficiency to the multi-stream rotary nozzles, but is going to be a better fit for larger areas. So if you happen to have a very large property, or if you are, see some of our city folks are joining us today, you know, if we're thinking about our public park spaces and commercial lawns, that's where we would use these rotor heads. All right, number 5 is don't set it and forget it. Unfortunately, we see many times across North Texas that we might have a habit of getting really comfortable with this automated irrigation. We've set a program and then we just kind of forget about it, and it continues to run whether or not it's appropriate for that system to run or not. I know in my neighborhood that I very often will see sprinkler systems running every single day. Even right now when we're under watering restrictions, we see them running every single day. We'll see them running in the middle of a rainstorm. We'll see them running after we've gotten 7 inches of rain. It's really the downside of relying on automated irrigation. It's really easy for us to get complacent, and then all of a sudden we're wasting water. And so my recommendation is, if at all possible, stick with turning your irrigation on manually as needed. I never run an automated program in my yard. We always only turn the irrigation on as needed to try to reach our watering goals. We do it based on the stress that we're seeing in that lawn. And that just helps us to make sure that we don't run this irrigation system at a time that it doesn't make sense. You know, similar to thinking about making sure we're not running it in the rain, we also want to make sure that these systems aren't running in the winter time. Very often I'll see people leave their irrigation running twice a week all winter long. That's not appropriate up here with our warm season grasses. It's very inefficient and irresponsible to do that. Very often in the winter months, we get enough natural rainfall that we should never need to turn our irrigation on, even to keep our soil moisture up. It's very rare that we would have an instance where we would need to apply any water. And if we did, it would be a one-time thing, not something where we need a regular program. I encourage you, if you do have an in-ground irrigation system, sprinkler system, that you get to know it. You learn a little bit about the nozzles and heads, like I talked about a couple slides ago, and you also learn the precipitation rate for your system. If you really start to dig around a little bit on recommendations for efficient watering practices, you'll very often find that those recommendations are going to come in the form of inches of water. And so if we don't know at all how much our sprinkler system is actually putting out within a given time frame, it's going to be very difficult for us to implement more responsible watering practices. And, you know, a lot of times I'll ask people, how often or how much are you watering per week? And they'll just say, oh, about 20 minutes per zone. But they won't know what that actually equates to in terms of the number of inches or the actual amount of water that's going out. So we can do something really simple like a catch can test. That's what you're seeing in this picture here. You can purchase catch cans online pretty easily, or you can use something like tuna fish cans or coffee cans and have a similar result. But the goal is that we're going to take 5 to 9 of those cans and we're going to distribute them within each of my irrigation zones, run that zone for 5 minutes if I've got spray nozzles, or 15 if I've got multi-stream rotary nozzles. And I'm going to see how many inches of water am I actually capturing within that fixed amount of time. And that way, when I go and I use a program like the WaterMyYard program, which you have at your disposal, and that WaterMyYard program texts me or emails me and says you should put out half an inch of water per week, or half an inch of water this week to keep your lawn healthy and happy. I know exactly how long to run each of those zones to put out that half inch. You know, if I don't have that familiarization with my irrigation system, I'm not going to be able to do that very effectively. Now, even if you don't want to do a comprehensive catch can audit like you see here, you could do something as simple as getting a couple of those catch cans or a rain gauge just sit one out in a couple of your zones and do the same thing to at least get some idea of what that precipitation rate looks like. The advantage to having multiple catch cans like you see here is that I'm also going to get a sense of my coverage uniformity. I should be seeing around the same amount of water captured across that irrigation zone. Pretty often though, that we will see perhaps that I might catch, quarter of an inch over here, half an inch on the other side. So Jeannie just asked a great question. How do we find the precipitation rate with a drip irrigation system? So it kind of depends on how your drip system is set up. But very often what we should be able to do is actually go to the source. So if your drip irrigation system is connected to an outdoor spigot or similar main source, you should be able to just literally capture how much water is coming out of that source. There's some math that we can do from there to then calculate how much water is coming out of that drip line. It can be a little bit more complicated. What I can tell you though is that typically with most drip systems, if you run that system for about an hour to 75 minutes, you're going to put out about a half an inch of water. And just depending on how your drip system is set up, there can be some other more effective ways to learn exactly how much your output is. In fact, each emitter that you've got in that system has a particular outflow of water. So we can do some basic math to kind of calculate if each of these emitters is putting out, 2 gallons per hour. Then I can do some basic math to kind of calculate a little bit what my outflow is, but it just really depends on how that system is set up. Can you use the catch can test if you use manual sprinklers in your yard? This is a great question. Sure, you can do a version of this. What I've recommended to people before is a lot of times they've got some favorite spots where they put that manual sprinkler. So you might flag those so that you know exactly where you're putting that sprinkler and then spread those catch cans out to that coverage area. You'll still be able to get some kind of sense of how long you need to run that manual sprinkler to put out your desired output. And then you'll kind of know exactly where you need to move it each time you put it out there to get the desired coverage as well. So number 7 is going to be to water deeply and infrequently. This is going to be another one that's counterintuitive for a lot of people. I get a lot of folks that get really upset when we get into stage 1 and stage 2 watering restrictions. The idea of only being able to water 1 to 2 times per week just really gets them anxious about the health of their lawn. But what I will tell you is that for many of our established lawns, as well as other established perennials in the landscape that are growing in the native soil, deep and infrequent watering is actually a best practice, even when water is readily available. When we go out and we water just a little bit every single day, we actually promote very codependent plants with very shallow root systems, and we lose a lot of the potential resilience of that lawn and of those other plant materials. When I go out and let's say that I water deeply, aiming to wet the upper 6 to 8 inches of the soil, I want there to be enough time between watering that the top begins to dry down, because as that top part starts to dry down, my roots are going to reach for that water that's still there deeper in the soil profile. If I go out and I water the upper 2 inches every day, my roots are just going to sit there in the upper 2 inches, and they're never going to be motivated, for lack of a better word, to grow deeper in that soil. So I'm actually doing myself a disservice by doing that kind of watering. Much more effective to water 1 to 2 times per week for as long as I can, to encourage that really deep root growth and really try to encourage that water to move into my soil profile as deeply as it can go. That starts by changing out your nozzles so that you get that low and slow precipitation rate. And then we can also adopt this cycle and soak practice. So those of you that have not heard of this before, this is an extremely important practice for us in North Texas. Up here in this part of the state, a lot of the counties that we're in have Blackland Prairie clay soils. They have what are called shrinking swelling soils or smectitic soils. And so this means that it can be challenging sometimes to get good water infiltration or movement into those soils. Those of you that have lived up here a long time, I'm you completely know what I'm talking about, right? As soon as we try to run the sprinkler system, once those soils dry out even a little bit, or even if they're pretty saturated, we're going to see a lot of that water run off pretty quickly because the soils are just very fine, very firm. And so one way that we can promote deeper water movement is I'm going to pulse that water in more gradually in stages. And so that's where this cycle and soak idea comes from. So let's say that I've done a precipitation, I've learned my precipitation rate. I know that to run my multi-stream rotary nozzles and get 1/2 inch of output, I need to run those for about 45 minutes. But I also know that even with my multi-stream rotary nozzles, if I run it for 45 minutes straight, I'm going to start to see runoff. So instead, what I might do is I might break that into 3 waterings for 15 minutes with a 30 to 60-minute rest in between. And what that does is it hits that soil, allows time for that water to move into that soil, and then comes back and hits it again. So it's just introducing that water more gradually at a rate that it's able to take in that water. So we get a little bit more efficiency and typically deeper water movement. Many newer irrigation systems are going to make this pretty easy for you to program. Just need to revisit your instruction manual, and you should be able to identify exactly how to program it. Even if you have an older system, you'll find a lot of times that if you visit the manufacturer website, there may be some retrofit or retro programming instructions to get this desired effect. What I will tell you is that there are actually a lot of really good YouTube videos about this, if it's something you're interested in, but this is going to be a really important practice for us to implement up here in North Texas. We also, of course, want to make sure that we're watering in the early morning hours. Most of the time, I do not have to explain to Texans why we don't water in the middle of the day here. We know it's hot, it's dry, it's windy. We're going to get a lot of evaporative losses. It's not going to be efficient or effective. Now, the reason why we don't always encourage evening watering is that sometimes it can promote plant disease or turf disease, especially as I move into the fall. I might see that too much evening watering on our lawns in the fall can lead to large patch disease, or some of you may refer to this as brown patch disease. This is a disease that starts to become active as our temperatures drop back down in September, October. And if I'm doing a lot of evening watering, I can really create conditions to promote this disease, especially if I've got a St. Augustine or a zoysia grass lawn. And so instead, evening or early morning watering is going to allow me to put that water out at a time when the grass can take it up and use it effectively and then dry out fairly quickly. So I'm reducing the period of leaf wetness. I want to try to keep those leaves as dry as possible. A lot of times somebody will ask me, well, what does this mean, early morning hours? This can fluctuate a little bit throughout the year. So you'll see a lot of times people will say, well, just try to get out there and water before 9 or before 10. But in the summertime here in Texas, we may start to get pretty dry and windy well before 9 o'clock in the morning. So what I typically recommend to people is try to get your watering in within the 2 to 3 hours before sunrise or leading right up to sunrise. As soon as the sun starts to rise here in Texas, a lot of times the wind begins to pick up. So we want to try to find that sweet spot where we're pretty close to the morning time. Maybe we're starting to get a little bit of light coming up, but we're not so far into morning that we start to have other challenges like wind. So in terms of fertilization, number one practice that I recommend to people is don't guess what your lawn needs in terms of fertilization. If you're going to pay to put out a fertilizer product or any kind of product on your lawn, understand what you're putting out and whether or not your lawn actually needs that product. I do a lot of work with the green industry. I have a lot of respect for people that work in that industry. I will tell you that sometimes when we go to a big box store and we look at the shelves there, it's really easy to do more than we need. With some of those products. And so what I suggest to people is early spring or in the fall, get out there and collect a soil sample, just like you would do for your vegetable garden or some of your ornamental beds. If you're a really big hobbyist or enthusiast, you might ask for a soil probe this holiday season. You can get a pretty good one for $50 to $75. You do want to get one with a foot peg though, because our soils are firm. And, if you don't have that, then you can get out there with a hand trowel. You don't want to be out there when the soil is very dry or you're going to bend your shovel. But you want to collect several samples across that lawn so you can get a good average of what those soil characteristics look like across the entire area. If I pull all my sample from just one spot in that lawn, I may hit just kind of a weird spot that doesn't actually reflect the rest of the lawn. And what I'm going to do is collect that soil at about a 6-inch depth. You can collect it in a 5-gallon bucket and remove a lot of the grass or other vegetative debris, mix it up really good. Sometimes if the soil is really wet, what I might do is just spread it out on some butcher paper just overnight before I ship it. And then I'll bag it up and I'll ship it to, we have a soil testing lab in College Station. All you have to do is visit soiltesting.tamu.edu. There's the website right there on the slide. You can visit your local county extension office. I assume many of you guys that are joining today are probably going to be in Collin County, possibly Dallas County. And so you can visit your local county extension office if you would like to get our soil testing bags, as well as the printed forms, or you can pack your soil in your own bags. Usually I recommend that people use paper sacks as opposed to a Ziploc bag. You're just going to have less of an impact on the properties of that soil when you use a paper sack, and you can print our submission forms off online if you don't want to deal with going into your county office. What this is going to tell you when you get your soil test back is it'll give you a sense of your soil pH. This is the acidity or alkalinity of the soil. And this is important because it sort of gives us information on how many nutrients are available in my soil and which grasses and plant materials are going to be best suited for my soil. A lot of times here in North Texas, we're going to be more on the alkaline side. That means our pH is typically going to be a little bit higher. Pretty often I will see a pH somewhere between about 6.8 and 7.4, depending on where you are in the Metroplex. Sometimes as we go further west, we might see that get even higher. We'll also be able to get a sense of the conductivity of the soil. It's not a huge issue up here unless you happen to be using gray water, reclaimed water, then that's something you might want to keep an eye on. Most importantly, what we're going to get from this is our nutrient availability. That's what we're really looking for. This soil test report is going to give you recommendations for what fertilizers you actually need. Now, when it comes to our lawn, most lawns are going to require some amount of nitrogen on an annual basis. And we don't necessarily use the soil test for nitrogen because nitrogen is extremely dynamic. And we may see that nitrogen levels change dramatically within just a couple of weeks around that soil test. So instead, we might use species-based recommendations, which I'll share. But what we really want to pay attention to here is the need for phosphorus, the need for potassium, the need for micronutrients like iron. Plants actually need as many as 18 essential elements. Not all of those need to be applied in fertilizers, but there's more that may go into this than most people realize. However, very often in North Texas, we really don't need to apply additional phosphorus. We see a lot of misinformation out there that you should apply phosphorus at certain levels every year regardless, and this is false information. Phosphorus should really only be applied if our soil test is telling us that that phosphorus is required and needed. Over applying phosphorus can actually be very environmentally detrimental. It can get into our streams, our rivers, our lakes, and create contamination issues and algae bloom issues. We also see that phosphorus sourcing is not always sustainable. And so we only want to use phosphorus if we really see that we're needing it based on the soil test. We only want to apply fertilizer when turf grass is actively growing. What I will tell you guys is that right now, I would not recommend any fertilizer applications. It is extremely hot, extremely dry. Applying fertilizers right now could actually be pretty detrimental to lawn health. And so instead, what I would typically recommend to people is make your first fertilizer application in the spring once you've mowed your grass, not your weeds, but your grass twice. That's an indication that your lawn is actively growing. It's ready to start taking up some of those nutrients. So A lot of times for us, that will fall typically around May timeframe, because that's when we really start to see our grass wake up. So that's when we would make our first application. Then beyond that, we typically recommend that you would make maybe 2 more applications throughout the growing season. The first would probably be about 6 to 8 weeks after that first application, if you're still seeing that your lawn is actively growing. And then the final application would typically be probably around September. We want to make sure that our last fertilizer application goes out around 6 weeks before the historic first frost date. If we apply fertilizer, particularly nitrogen fertilizer, too late in the year, it can increase the likelihood of winter injury. Basically, you're promoting too much of that succulent green growth too late in the season. And if we happen to get a freeze while it's growing in that way, it's going to cause more injury to that lawn. So I saw Helen in here. She said, I heard to fertilize your yard on holidays. I'm going to say loosely, yes. Memorial Day is not a bad time to think about that first application. Like I said, in May, 4th of July could be the one that I think is a little bit iffy, because depending on how dry we are up here, it might be too hot, too dry, not necessarily suitable conditions for an application. So instead, up here in North Texas, I might be more interested in something like a Cinco de Mayo or mid-May application, followed by a mid to late June application, as long as I'm still seeing pretty good temperatures and rainfall. And then I probably won't apply again until late summer, early fall. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of times for nitrogen, we're going to base it on the species. I thought maybe I had my nitrogen table in here, but I don't think I do. What I would say is if you've got Bermuda grass, you're looking at applying probably about 2 to 4 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet every growing season. So that's, between May and October, or whatever that growing season looks like for the year. St. Augustine is probably going to be closer to 1 to 3 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000. The two that I really want to make sure I hit on are zoysia grass and buffalo grass. If you've got a native grass lawn, you really should almost never be fertilizing. You could do maybe a 1/2 pound or 1 pound of nitrogen in the spring if you're seeing that it might need it. But too much nitrogen fertilizer can really hurt a native grass lawn. And similarly with zoysia grass, we're going to see that the requirement is less. Usually 1 to 2 pounds per year, for the most part, is sufficient, unless we're seeing signs that that zoysia lawn needs more, which would be some yellowing, chlorosis. It's not growing as quickly as I feel it should be. But too much nitrogen on a zoysia lawn can also be detrimental. We want to make sure that we keep fertilizer on the lawn. This is just a good watershed protection practice. We want to, if we're putting a product out, we see it's spilling all over the sidewalk, take a broom out there, sweep that back onto your lawn, avoid liquid overspray onto the sidewalk and driveway. Try to keep your fertilizer where plants can really take it up and filter those nutrients to avoid those nutrients going into our stormwater. Yvonne also asked a great question. Are organic fertilizers better than non-organic? There's pros and cons to both. So what I typically recommend to people is that if you've got an older, more established lawn, an all organic program is going to be a little bit easier to implement. If you've got a younger lawn, you may have to supplement occasionally, especially for that first application each year, with a more soluble synthetic product, just to make sure that your yard has enough of those nutrients to help get it into the year. What we actually see with older, more established lawns, if your property is 20, 25 years old and that same lawn's been there most of the time, you've actually got some really good organic matter that's built up in that lawn over time, and we don't see nearly the nitrogen requirements. An organic product is typically going to have lower concentrations of nutrients, and the nutrients are going to be released more slowly because they require mineralization, or basically they require microbes to break them down into a plant available form for them to become available. Quick release products are going to be less sustainable, and they're also going to typically have a greater potential to burn the lawn or to have to move where we don't mean for them to go, because often they're very soluble. But occasionally I may need a product that lawn's going to take up very quickly and assimilate very quickly to keep it healthy. So if you've got a younger lawn, finding a balance between the two, mixing and matching a little bit to meet your goals can be a good way to go. Or if you want kind of an in-between, you can look for a synthetic slow release product. So you might get a little bit more nitrogen out of that, maybe a little bit different release timeline, but it won't be quite as prone to environmental losses as a quick release product would be. All right, so we're getting there. We're moving along. So I've worked as an extension specialist now for over 4 years, and I spent the first 2 years of my career with A&M working as a statewide turfgrass extension specialist. And what I can tell you is that unfortunately, the availability of lawn care products makes it to where we see a lot of people that are very quick to apply a product just to try to make a problem go away, whether or not it's the right product or the right time. And we know that, applying a pesticide unnecessarily is not going to be a good use of our time, our money, and it is going to potentially put beneficial things in our landscape at risk. So I have nothing against using pesticides when we've got a really challenging issue in the landscape, but if you are going to use them, please take the time to properly identify the pest that you're dealing with. If you need to consult with your county extension agent or a specialist like myself to help you get through that process, then please do so. I'll give you guys just some examples of some things that I see that happen a lot of times, and we'll just walk through each of these. So this first one here, we know it's a grub. One of the things that I'll commonly see in lawns and landscapes is that people will be out in their compost bins and their raised beds and their vegetable gardens in the early spring, March or April, and they'll find these big fat grubs in that soil, and they'll start smashing them and killing them, and they'll brag to me. They'll say, "Oh, I found the biggest grubs in my compost bin. I smashed every single one." But what we see here is we have several hundreds of species of beetles in Texas that produce grubs. Only 3 of those are turf feeding. The other grubs that we see are actually beneficial insects that help to feed on decaying material and compost and contribute to the health of our soils. If you're seeing very large grubs in your compost bins, those are more likely to be associated with a beetle like a rhino beetle than a June bug or some kind of turf feeding insect. The only time that we should be controlling for grubs is if we are truly seeing those grubs active in the turf. We're seeing them cause physical damage. And typically the best time of year to treat for those is going to be probably around June here in North Texas. We'll continue to see damage for them sometimes all the way into this time of year in August, but I don't recommend putting out an insecticide then either, because these grubs are in what we call the third instar stage. It's when they're the fattest and the happiest. And a lot of our insecticide products don't actually work on them in that stage. So that's not a great time to apply those products either. So we want to scout for these typically in June. The damage will look a little bit like drought stress. And then if I go and I pull on that turf, I'm going to find that it pulls up very easily because the grubs are feeding in that layer between the leaves and the roots. And I should be able to, with a little prying with a shovel, peel that turf back and see these grubs. A lot of times our threshold for treatment is going to be about 7 to 10 grubs per square foot. So if you're not clearly seeing that, please stay away from using an insecticide product. Please confirm that if you are going to use it, it's the right time of year to treat those insects. If you are suspicious that there's another insect there, make sure that you properly identify it. We see that insecticide products, this is true of any pesticide, it's not going to work equally on all pests within that category. And the instructions for using that product are going to differ depending on which pest you're targeting. If I'm trying to target grubs, I'm going to see instructions on that product to water it in to where those grubs are active. If instead my primary pest is a fall armyworm, then I don't want to water that product in because the fall armyworms are feeding on the leaves and that I need that product to stay on the leaves. So again, the importance of properly identifying what am I targeting, why, what's the right product, what's the right time of year, and what's the most appropriate way to use that product. We see similar challenges sometimes with weeds. This weed that you see in here in the center photo is called goosegrass. We see it sometimes in lawns. I would say up here in North Texas, probably our most problematic grassy weeds are going to be Dallas grass, King Ranch bluestem, and crabgrass. Similarly, depending on the specific weeds we're targeting, certain products are just flat out not going to be effective. So I'm going to put my grass through some degree of unnecessary stress. I'm going to waste time, money, energy putting that product out. It's not going to be effective. So I'll use the example of Dallas grass. That's a very common, very challenging weed that we have here in North Texas. If you're a homeowner, there is nothing you can use that will selectively control that Dallas grass and not also kill your native grass. In other words, if you want to kill that Dallas grass, you're going to have to use a product like Roundup to kill it, or you're going to have to hire a professional to come in and get rid of it. Beyond that, it's going to be digging it up with a shovel, which those rhizomes go very deep, or some similar practice. But yet every year, we see a lot of folks that they go and get some weed be gone or something like that, try to saturate those weeds. It's not going to do anything. And in the meantime, you might stress your turf out unnecessarily using that product. Last thing here is going to be disease. I'll just talk about pretty quickly. The disease you see here in this photo, this is large patch disease. This is, I mentioned the term brown patch earlier. Brown patch is a disease we only see in cool season turf. It does not exist in warm season turf. So if you've got tall fescue or a ryegrass lawn, then you might have brown patch. If you've got what you see here and you've got Bermuda, zoysia, St Augustine, you have large patch disease. And this is a disease that we see most visible a lot of times in the spring, but the best time to treat for it is preventatively in the fall. And so this is another great example. If I've got a long-standing history with this disease and I want to try to use a fungicide to control it, I actually need to do a preventative application in the fall, typically when our soil temperatures get to between 80 and 70 degrees. So usually you're looking at third week of September, okay? Around the same time you would do your pre-emergent. That's when I would put a product out. I can target low-lying areas where I know this disease comes up every single year, and that's going to be the most effective way to use that product. But if I'm really only seeing this in the spring, my inclination is going to be to try to go get a product in the spring and apply it in the spring. And I'm not going to necessarily see that that's effective. So again, take time to try to properly ID what you're dealing with, what you're seeing. Jeannie asked a great question. How can we ID the type of grub? There are some unique physical characteristics of these turf feeding grubs that you can look for. There's some extension publications online I can share through Helen, or you can contact me directly and I can get that to you. But like I mentioned, the best way is that you're actually seeing them physically damage your turf. If you're seeing them in your compost bin or your vegetable garden, those are most likely not turf feeding grubs because they're not hanging out in the turf. So if you're seeing that damage in your turf, that's a good indication that those might be turf feeding grubs. I'm a big fan of integrated pest management programs. I won't spend too much time on this today because we're getting low on time and I want to make sure we have more time for questions. When we're thinking about pest management, very often, we get into a mindset of what can I spray to kill it? And this is not going to be the most effective way to really holistically control pests in our landscape. A lot of times a pest has shown up in the first place because there's something else going on that's making my turf grass more susceptible to that pest. So if I don't address that underlying issue and all I do is spray a chemical to kill that pest, I'm probably going to continue to have issues over and over and over again. So, we can think about preventative control is just being smart about what you bring into your lawn and landscape and how it might introduce a problem. Anytime you have new seeds, sod, sprigs, compost, mulch, topsoil, all of those things can introduce an issue. Not a whole lot we can do about this besides just try to make sure we're purchasing these things from reputable sources. There is actually a US compost certification council that can certify the quality of compost products. Similarly, there's an organization that certifies the quality of mulch products. So do a little bit of research on this. Try to make sure that when you're purchasing a product, you feel like you can trust the quality of that product. Avoid buying something off the back of somebody's truck if you don't know them. Cultural control is a lot of the things we talked about today. Anything you can do to keep a balanced, appropriate management program that's going to keep your turfgrass lawn healthy and naturally competitive. This is just a balanced approach. It's very possible to underlove our lawn, which many of us have anxiety about. It's equally, if not more possible, to overlove it. You see plenty of people that overwater, over-fertilize, over-apply pesticides, and then they continue to have more and more and more issues, and they don't understand. They get so frustrated. They've put so much money and time and products into trying to keep that lawn healthy, and it's probably an issue of overlove. You've put too much now into that system and you've knocked it off balance in another way. So really trying to be judicious in what we do, understanding why, and doing only what we think our lawn really needs, recognizing these grasses are much more resilient than people give them credit for. Mechanical control is just good regular mowing, pulling weeds by hand, keeping your mulch down in your beds. Biological control, we have still fairly limited options, but if you've got backyard chickens, you've got a form of biological control. And then chemical control is just the appropriate use of both natural and synthetic pesticide products. So making sure that if we do use those products, we use them in an effective way, we follow the directions, we understand why we're using them and the proper way and timing around using those products. Dennis asked a question about best product for large patch disease. There is a publication, a fact sheet from AgriLife on large patch management. There's several products that would be very effective on large patch. One example is going to be any product that has the basic active ingredient in it called azoxystrobin. I'm going to put it in the chat. This is an active ingredient that you'll find in many fungicide products, and this is going to be an active that is pretty effective at large patch prevention. And so as an objective broker of Texas A&M AgriLife, I'm not allowed to speak to my preferences around any particular brand. I do actually have colleagues, friends of mine up north that work for that company Sunday that I have tremendous respect for. So I'll say that, but I haven't personally worked with that brand yet. All right, quick little note about pre-emergence. I'm a big fan of these. If you're willing to use herbicides in the landscape, this is a great, just basic program to have. It's going to prevent a lot of the challenging annual weeds that we have from coming up. If you've got a Dallas grass issue, this is not going to do pretty much anything for that. Those are perennial weeds. They come back every year from rhizomes. These are products that are going to primarily provide a barrier for seeded plants. So we typically recommend 2 pre-emergent applications a year, one in the spring, one in the fall. Sometimes it's hard to find a product that just does this. And what I will caution you about is trying to get a product that does too many things is going to probably lead to you doing one of those things at the wrong time. So for example, I get a lot of folks that do some kind of weed and feed product to put out their spring pre-emergent. That product also has fertilizer in it. Well, we're putting out that pre-emergent typically in late February. That's almost 3 months before when I said we should start fertilizing, right? So I suggest if you can find a product that's just a pre-emergent, you might look for language like weed preventer. That's going to give you a little bit more control over this timing. Sometimes it helps to go to a co-op or a feed store to find options that we don't see at the big box stores, just FYI. So typically spring application is going to be when our soil temperatures hit around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. For us in North Texas, this is typically going to be third week of February, possibly leading into the first couple of weeks of March, just depends on the year. Look for ambient temperatures of 60 to 65 for 4 or 5 consecutive days. Similarly, in the fall, we're going to make those applications when our soil temperatures get to around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. typically for us, that's going to be about the third week of September. Can vary a little bit from year to year. 2019 is a great example. We really didn't cool off. We really didn't have rainfall until November. And so that would have been a year where we might have pushed that application just a little bit later, but it can be hard in Texas because we're just so unpredictable. Pre-emergent timing is, we base it on soil temperatures because that's what's driving a lot of times weed germination. The weeds aren't sitting with a little calendar waiting for a specific date. They're waiting on particular climate and environmental conditions. So that's why we're looking at that. I do want to caution you to not over apply pre-emergent herbicides. This can create issues with turfgrass rooting. And if you've got known issues, if you know that you've got a take all root rot issue or severe disease issues in that lawn, those would be times where I would skip a pre-emergent application, because pre-emergent products are really intended for healthy lawns. They can at least temporarily inhibit root growth on that lawn. And so if you're already dealing with some other kind of issue, disease issue or stress issue, that could potentially just exacerbate that problem. One of the last things here is it's okay to go blonde. Most of our warm season grasses up here, particularly Bermuda, buffalo, zoysia grass, they have the ability to go into what we call summer dormancy. That means that under extreme heat and drought conditions, they are intentionally going dormant the way that they would in the wintertime to survive that period of extreme heat and drought. And in fact, if we push too hard to keep it green, we're kind of working against its natural resilience mechanisms. And so, this time of year, particularly right now, I would say if your lawn is already looking like this, just let it be. Okay. When we start to get some natural rainfall again in the late summer, it'll start to green back up a little bit and it'll recover naturally on its own. But as we're moving into this more and more extreme drought condition, it's okay for a lot of these grasses. If you're doing everything right the rest of the time, they're going to go dormant and they will come back whenever rainfall becomes available again, and they will be just fine. And we really want to encourage that more and more up here in North Texas with a lot of these grasses. It's okay to go blonde for summer. You're not going to hurt anything. In fact, you might be hurting more by trying to force it to stay green. I've tried to encourage people more and more to think of this as a badge of honor. Like I said, I'm driving around the North Texas area. I live in Collin County. When I see a yard that's too green, especially if it's not in the shade, I'm judging it. Okay. So, it's okay to go blonde and make sure that you enjoy your lawn. I'm not enjoying mine very much right now because it's very crunchy and hot, but come late summer, early fall, I'll be out there again, hanging out with my dogs and spending a good time out there. All right, I've seen a couple more questions come through. How often do you water St. Augustine grass that has gone dormant due to stress? St. Augustine grass can be one that I like to baby just a little bit more. If you're, depending on the watering restrictions you're under, if you can continue to water about once per week, but really trying to prioritize a nice deep soaking with each of those waterings, at least trying to put out about 1/2 inch per week. That would probably be desirable. And again, making sure that you keep that mowing height a little taller on that St. Augustine. Yeah, Jeannie, that's a good question. Drier grass can potentially pose a fire hazard. You might try to keep a little bit more of a living vegetative buffer closer to your house. We don't typically hear of too many issues with this in suburban residential areas, but it can potentially be a concern. And so, thinking about that, trying to have some good living vegetative buffers, some plant materials that are going to stay greener, even in this drier weather can be a good way to go. All right. Any other questions? So I will be sure to do a final couple of little plugs. One is going to be, again, for that WaterMyYard program. Helen put the link in the chat. That's a great resource for you to try to really get informed watering recommendations for your area. And then the other thing that I'll just mention briefly is that we're anticipating the launch of a new, those of you that have St. Augustine, we plan to have a new St. Augustine grass from the Texas A&M turfgrass breeding program available beginning more next year, called Cobalt. This is a St. Augustine that uses potentially 60 to 80% less water than any other St. Augustine currently on the commercial market. If you're not a St. Augustine fan, there's a lot of turfgrass breeding improvements that are happening with other species as well. So if you haven't looked at that in a while, do a little research. I'll share a little website with you for our turfgrass producers of Texas. If you're interested, it's just texasgrass.com. Marilyn's asking, what is good grub control? How often should I fertilize my zoysia? I would fertilize your zoysia 3 times a year, similar to what we talked about for these other programs. But instead of doing a full 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square foot rate, like we might for some grasses, I would stick with just doing about a 1/2 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. So that would be, again, probably around early to mid-May, again in mid to late June, and then again in September before we get too close to the end of the year. That would be putting out a total of around 1.5 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. If you're seeing that the zoysia still looks like it's a little bit chlorotic or not as dense, you can increase that. But as I mentioned earlier, zoysia can be sensitive to too much nitrogen. We have Bermuda grass. Any tips other than what's covered today? So Diana, you'll find that Bermuda grass, that you can't kill it if you try. So, sometimes it may not look the prettiest. I would just recommend, balanced fertilization, focus on deep and infrequent irrigation to keep those roots healthy, happy whenever water's available. But in general with Bermuda, I wouldn't worry about it as much as some other grasses. What about removing most old growth in the spring? There's kind of a split camp about this. It can be beneficial, especially if you've seen, going into the winter, if you're out there walking around and you feel that turf's really spongy under your feet, it can be a sign that you've got a lot of thatch buildup, and a little debris removal could be beneficial. What I will just caution you about is, in the spring, the timing for this can be a little tricky. We typically recommend that if you are going to scalp, it needs to be either just prior to green up, which can be really hard to nail down, or potentially just after green up. I don't recommend doing this practice for St. Augustine. St. Augustine does not have rhizomes in the soil to protect it from severe above ground injury. But if you have Bermuda or zoysia, you can remove that growth in the early spring, bag it, take it out. The potential risks of doing that are you're exposing more of the soil to weed growth. Okay. So you might see greater weed encroachment or weed infestation. And if you happen to get a late season frost and you've done that scalping, you can potentially have some pretty severe injury. So those would be the consequences. The advantages to doing it, like I said, are just you're removing some of that debris, which can, if it gets too dense, can cause insect and disease issues. Do we need to aerate it? You can aerate. I only recommend this for a lawn if you're seeing clear signs that you've got a compaction issue, meaning that water's ponding very quickly when you try to irrigate, the ground feels very hard, the turf is thinning out, and it doesn't look very healthy, as though it's maybe not able to take root very effectively. If you do aerate up here in North Texas, I would typically recommend you try to target late spring, early summer. You want there to be sufficient rainfall and optimum temperatures for that lawn to recover, because it is a stress injury. You definitely do not want to aerate right now. You will damage the aerifier on our hard soils and potentially really injure that turf. But if you're seeing some issues, you can do it next year.
Thank you so much, Becky. This was fantastic. I feel that there's hope for my blonde lawn. So, so just a reminder to everybody, this session will be posted on the NTMWD YouTube page for your reference and to share. Also, you can visit ntmwd.com/classes to see the rest of our classes, and also to see links to the ones that were recorded. And Becky, you're getting a lot of thank yous into the chat. And also I want to thank everybody for attending today, and for those who who sent me their email addresses for the native plant giveaway. Good luck to you. We'll do the drawing after our last class, which is going to be on August 30th. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day. Love your lawns.
Thank you.